Over 100 years ago, this site was the epicenter of one of the greatest battles in the history of American labor rights. For it was on this site, in what is now a public park, that the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation opened its watch painting factory in 1917. What the... In the early 20th century, the United States was in something of a radium craze. Many thought the newly discovered material had near miraculous medicinal properties, and it had a wonderful glow that led to its inclusion in a myriad of different products. Snake oil salesmen and entrepreneurs of the time were eager to capitalize on the new trend, and so put radium in anything from face creams to makeup, tonics, and even a brand of radium butter. Critically, for this story, the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation opened its watchmaking factory after the style of watches with glow-in-the-dark numbers had become immensely popular after the First World War. The watch painting process was simple. Factory workers, almost always young women, applied radium-based paint onto paper watch faces using a very fine brush. You see, the problem with a brush, no matter how fine, is that the bristles tend to fray as you put pressure on them. The water-based paint on these brushes also had a tendency to dry quickly. The workers needed a way to re-wet their brushes and keep the point of their bristles. The four women at the factory came up with a technique they called lip, dip, and paint. The technique involved using your lips to reform the point of the bristles and using your spit to keep the brush wet. Now, the eagle-eyed among you may have noticed that the lip, dip, and paint technique involves eating paint. Radium aside, any finger-painting kindergartner might be able to tell you that eating paint is not a good idea. Over the course of dozens of watches a day for months and sometimes years, these factory workers ingested significant amounts of paint. There was nothing to worry about, right? The factory workers weren't in any danger. Radium was a wonder material after all, right? Unright. While factory workers, without any protective gear, were working in close proximity with powderized radium, company chemists in labs were working with radium behind lead-lined aprons and ivory-tipped tongs, under the direction of this man, the fabulously mustachioed Dr. Sabin von Sachaki. The foremost expert on radium in the United States at the time, he studied under Marie and Pierre Curie, who discovered radium. Von Sachaki was evidently scared of radium because when a small shard of radium stuck on the tip of his finger, he cut it off. To figure out what Dr. von Sachaki was so afraid of, I've put together a little demonstration about the different types of radiation. First, there's the alpha particle, the biggest of the group. It doesn't do a lot of damage. It can be stopped by your skin or a piece of paper. It's like having a soccer ball thrown at you. The next type of radiation is called beta radiation. It's a little bit smaller, travels faster. It's like getting a ball bearing thrown at you. If you don't have some sort of metal shielding protecting you, it could hurt a little bit. The third type of radiation is called gamma radiation. It's infinitesimally small, extremely fast, and in a lot of ways, it's like getting shot. But the factory workers would have been fine, right? There's no way radium emits all three types of particles at once. Okay, no, that's exactly what it does. Through its chain of radioactive decay, radium emits alpha, beta, and gamma particles. What's more is that because it's in the same group as calcium, your body sees radium exactly like it does calcium and starts to store it where your body stores calcium, in your bones. To make a long story short, after about 3 to 5 years, the radium that's been taken up into your bones, usually joints and especially your jaw, you start to melt from the inside out. And there's a whole list of honestly horrifying symptoms that accompany that. The variable symptoms and long onset time posed a serious problem for diagnosing radium-based illnesses. Few, if any, doctors in the United States knew what radiation poisoning was, much less what it looked like on a practical level. Different radium girls got different diagnoses, ranging all the way from syphilis to early onset arthritis. And that's where the case remained, largely frozen. That was until 2 people, Dr. Edwin Lehman, the chief chemist at the U.S. Radium Corporation, and Sarah Maileffer, a dial painter, died within 2 weeks of each other in 1925. These sudden deaths attracted the attention of Essex County coroner Dr. Harrison Martland, a pathologist with a keen interest in why seemingly healthy young people in his county were melting from the inside out. In this endeavor, he found a source of help from an unlikely place. Dr. Sabin von Sochaki, former chief chemist at U.S. Radium and inventor of radium paint. When the USRC found a great deal of success selling its timepieces, they underwent a corporate restructuring and essentially kicked Dr. von Sochaki to the curb. With the help from Dr. von Sochaki, Dr. Martland made a ghastly discovery on the autopsy table. Not only were Sarah Maileffer's bones radioactive, her major organs were radioactive, as were her body tissues and her skin. As a matter of fact, to this very day, her corpse is radioactive, because radium has a half-life of 1,600 years. So, for the next 1,500 years, they'll be radioactive too. Again, with von Sochaki's help, Martland discovered a new technology for measuring radiation in the human body. Something like a breathalyzer for radiation poisoning. They used the new piece of technology to compile the melodramatically named, and I swear this is real, List of Doom. A list of 50 factory workers the two had measured, and were all found to be terminally ill owing to the amount of radiation coming out of their breath. Of course, these findings were disputed by U.S. Radium. They were disputed by handfuls of other doctors, too, and the American Medical Association. Despite all the pushback that Dr. Martland received about his findings, meager changes to the laws did come in 1927. Radium necrosis was added to the list of injuries covered under existing workmen's comp laws, and the U.S. Radium Corporation even paid off several factory workers that had become demonstrably ill. Story's over, right? Good guys win. But there was this little sneaky trick in that new law that passed in 1927. You see, the statute of limitations included in that law was only 2 years. Most of the factory workers took as long as 3 years to show symptoms, and some as long as 5. The law was designed from the very beginning to be a dud, meant to make sure that the U.S. Radium Corporation couldn't be held responsible for any of the injuries it caused its workers. And that meant one thing. The Radium Girls were plunged into the midst of the American legal system. The widely publicized case was set to begin in early 1928, pitting 5 terminally ill factory workers and their legal representation against the U.S. Radium Corporation, which had hired 3 separate law firms on its case. After a round of initial testimony from the girls, an adjournment of several months, and even a change of judge, the USRC agreed to settle out of court to the tune of $208,000 each, and a yearly pension of $8,000 for each of the factory girls on the lawsuit. As late as 1935, a court found that the statute of limitations on radium cases was only 2 years? Oh no, that can't be right. Due to this ruling, USRC was not legally culpable for any of the remaining radium poisoning cases, and no further lawsuits were filed against USRC by radium painters. How could this have happened? I mean, no substantive legal punishment for the U.S. Radium Corporation, no settlements in favors of any of these other factory girls. The good guys lost! The evil corporation won. The U.S. justice system failed. In almost every substantive sense, the U.S. Radium Corporation got off the hook. There were no more lawsuits, no substantive changes of laws. As a matter of fact, the company survived as far as the 1970s without having to pay for what they'd done. And it was only then because the EPA came after them because of pollution on their property. As a final addendum to this story, one of the titles of the chapters of an anthology source I consulted while writing my script was called Justice, and the chapter dealt all with the legal cases and the news cycle and the litigation that surrounded these cases of watch painters all over the country, not just here in Orange, but in places like Waterbury, Connecticut, or Ottawa, Illinois. And that struck me, because out of the hundreds of dial painters in all of these cities all across the United States, only about a dozen of them ever got any sort of compensation for the injuries they suffered on the job. They were lied to, cheated, and poisoned by their employers, failed by a legal system that was fundamentally ill-equipped to protect them, and who were forced to die in silence and poverty. You can look up the names of the Radium girls who won compensation. Like I said, there's about a dozen of them, and their names are well publicized, and they were on the front page of the New York Times. But this story really isn't about them, and that's why I haven't included many of them. It's about the hundreds of unnamed Radium girls, ones that had to suffer alone. The story isn't about the people who won, it's about the people who lost, and that's why I found it so amazing that there could be a chapter about this story called Justice.